What is a false confession? It's when someone who's being interrogated, for example by a law enforcement officer, claims responsibility for an offense they have not committed. Intuitively, most people would think that never happens, as the immediate consequence is often a conviction, and let's face it, that's usually what criminals and innocents alike try to avoid. So you'd be more than justified to wonder why anyone would ever confess to something they haven't actually done, when they're likely to get punished for it. One reason is coercion. Think back to the religious fanatics that plagued the Middle Ages who were forcing confessions of witchcraft and sorcery from hundreds of people under torture. If someone is peeling the skin off your living body, you might just about do anything simply to make the pain and terror stop. Even if you can still rationalize that you will probably be executed if you confess. Back in those days, they often just continued torturing you until you eventually confessed, so really admitting to being a witch was in a way the most reasonable decision you could make, as you would simply be tortured until you confess anyway. At least execution offered a way for the pain to stop, so in their desperation, most people opted for that. Coercive interrogation tactics are still being used today, believe it or not. They might be called enhanced interrogation techniques, used by military personnel on terrorism suspects, or they might be used by state governments or by terrorists themselves. Their effectiveness and moral standing have been under scrutiny for a while, and most researchers agree that they are lacking on both those counts. Nowadays, in the modern world, whilst torture and physical coercion are not being used in police interviews in the UK, a number of countries still use accusatorial interview methods, such as the USA, Canada, and many Asian countries. Accusatorial styles of interviewing often try to put the interviewer in control of the interview. They employ psychological manipulation to get a confession and use a lot of closed-ended, confirmatory questions. These types of interview are rather confrontational and presume from the outset that the suspect is guilty. There is a different style of interviewing, which is an information-gathering approach, where the goal is not a confession, but obtaining a true account of events from the suspect. This was introduced due to the high number of high-profile false confessions, and a change in law as a consequence of those cases in England and Wales through the introduction of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, in 1984. This prohibits using manipulative techniques and requires all interviews to be audio recorded. This is the interviewing style used by police in the UK, Norway, New Zealand and Australia. When you compare the two methods, accusatorial versus information gathering, to each other, you find that accusatorial interviews increase the risk of false confessions, whereas information gathering approaches do not tend to expose innocent parties to this increased risk, but still enable the interviewer to get a guilty suspect to admit their guilt. A systematic review was carried out to compare these two approaches further. A systematic review is a very thorough examination of all the relevant studies of a high enough standard that have been conducted in this area. This review found that both techniques were better at obtaining true confessions from guilty suspects than interviews using none of those tactics. Information-gathering interviews elicited a greater proportion of true confessions, whilst also significantly reducing the risk of false confessions. The other main factor contributing to false confessions is personal and psychological vulnerabilities of the suspect. As you know, many, if not most of the people that police have to arrest and interview have mental health problems and are therefore psychologically vulnerable, as are other members of the public who do not have mental health problems. The fact that they have been arrested and put into a cell might put anyone on edge. Whilst it might feel satisfying to the public or victim to hear that a suspect has made a confession to a particular crime, there have been a vast number of wrongful convictions which were built on false confessions. Youngsters and young adults are much more vulnerable to false confessions during police interviews than older adults. Also, the further on the ADHD, that is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, spectrum someone is, the more likely they are to make a false confession to police. It just so happens that 26% of the adult prison population and 30% of youths in prison have ADHD, and they have all been through the investigative interview process with police before they got sentenced to prison. Suggestibility is a main factor that can risk an individual making a false confession. This is the term for the tendency to accept and act on suggestions of others, for example, suggestions by an accusatorial interrogator. Interview techniques that use false evidence and leading questions, both of which are still legal interrogation practices in the USA, for example, can cause a high proportion of young adults to internalize and retell false beliefs about their own guilt. You can actually change a person's memories and even plant false memories in someone by feeding them the information you want the scenario to have and asking the individual to imagine having that experience. So, how do you avoid a false confession? If you want to conduct an ethical, effective interview, your goal should be obtaining the truth from the suspect, not a confession. Remember, the suspect in front of you might well be innocent. If you somehow get the wrong person to admit to a crime, the consequence is that the actual perpetrator, who might be a very dangerous individual, remains out in the community, whilst an innocent person is rotting in prison, potentially because of how they were interviewed. Conduct the interview without preconceptions about the suspect's guilt. Stay open-minded. Treat the suspect with respect and deal with them as an equal. Yes, as a law enforcement officer, you have a certain authority, but if you want to investigate properly, don't cloud the interview with that authority. Put your efforts into building rapport with the suspect. Look after them whilst they are with you and try to minimize the stress of the situation for them. Try to get them to relax and be transparent about the process of the interview. Check with them how they would like to be addressed, if they understand what you have explained, and that you can pause the interview if they get upset for any reason. Make an effort to establish a relationship that is collaborative rather than confrontational. If they really did commit the offense, make it easier for them to open up to you about it. Be honest with them if you want honesty in return. Do not use any kind of coercion, pressure, manipulation, or deception at any point in time. You are better than that, and in many countries that practice is now illegal. Use very clear language and questions that are easy to answer. Most of your questions should be open-ended, which means there's no one-word answer, such as yes or no, or Tuesday. Invite the suspect to give you their account and encourage them to provide details. Do not display any form of sarcasm, judgment, or intimidation. Even if they did actually commit the most heinous crime, whilst I'm not excusing their actions, you don't know what happened to them in their life to cause them to become this way. The majority of criminals started out as victims of some kind themselves. Finally, read up about humane, information gathering and rapport-based interview techniques. Imagine if you had done something wrong, what kind of person you would like to be interviewed by. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content useful. You can get an email with a PDF transcript of each new video that is uploaded right into your inbox. Just go to the main Dr IPIP website on dripip.com and you can input your details in the sidebar. Just enter your first name, your preferred email address, and the type of organization you work for. You will not get any spam. This is just for me to be able to let you know about new content.